What if I told you that your intelligence is actually your greatest weakness? That every careful decision you make, every fact you verify, every nuance you consider is precisely what's keeping you from real power in this world? Look around. TikTok influencers shape political opinions more than Nobel laureates. Crypto enthusiasts with barely a high school education convince Harvard MBAs to invest life savings in digital coins named after dogs. Meanwhile, climate scientists with decades of research struggle to get anyone to listen to their urgent warnings. This isn't some modern aberration. It's human nature revealing itself exactly as Niccolo Machiavelli predicted 5 centuries ago. The future doesn't belong to the smartest people. It belongs to those who understand something far more valuable than intelligence: how the human mind actually works when it's making decisions about who to follow and what to believe. Today, we're going to explore why your rationality might be your downfall, and why the people you dismiss as fools might possess the most dangerous kind of wisdom there is. Here's a psychological truth that will make you question everything. The more you know about a subject, the less confident you become about it. The less you know, the more certain you appear. This isn't opinion, it's measurable science. The Dunning-Kruger effect shows us that incompetent people consistently overestimate their abilities, while truly skilled individuals underestimate theirs. But here's the twist that changes everything. Confidence is immediately visible to others, while competence takes time and expertise to evaluate. Think about the last time you watched a political debate. Who won? Was it the candidate with the most accurate statistics, the deepest policy knowledge, or the most nuanced understanding of complex issues? Or was it the one who spoke with absolute certainty even when discussing topics that genuine experts know are impossibly complex? Machiavelli observed this exact pattern in Renaissance Italy. The vulgar crowd always is taken by appearances, and the world consists chiefly of the vulgar. Most people don't have the time, energy, or expertise to evaluate actual competence. They judge by confidence, presentation, and how someone makes them feel about themselves. Consider Elizabeth Holmes. She convinced some of the world's most accomplished investors to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into Theranos. These weren't naive people. They included former secretaries of state, renowned venture capitalists, and legendary business leaders. Yet none of them possessed the technical expertise to evaluate her claims about blood testing technology. Holmes understood something crucial. She didn't need to be the smartest person in the room. She needed to appear intelligent while avoiding the paralysis that comes with actual deep knowledge. She adopted Steve Jobs' aesthetic, spoke in a carefully practiced deeper voice, and surrounded herself with prestigious names who looked impressive but lacked relevant technical knowledge. The result? Brilliant scientists who actually understood blood chemistry were dismissed as pessimistic, while Holmes raised nearly $1 billion promoting fundamentally impossible technology. But Machiavelli's most chilling insight goes deeper than simple confidence tricks. He understood that the most successful manipulators don't win through superior arguments. They win by positioning themselves as protectors of people's sacred values. There is nothing more important than appearing to be religious, he wrote. This wasn't about actual religious belief. It was about understanding that people have values they consider sacred, values they'll defend at any cost, even when doing so seems economically or logically irrational. Contemporary research on sacred value defense confirms his observation. When people believe that their core values are under threat, they enter into what psychologists call sacred value defense mode. Normal cost-benefit thinking stops. They'll sacrifice wealth, safety, and logic to defend what they consider untouchable. Contemporary figures leverage this constantly. They don't spend energy proving their policies will work better. Instead, They position themselves as guardians of threatened values, while framing opponents as existential threats to everything followers hold dear. Consider how this plays out in practice. A leader might acknowledge that their approach seems harsh, but they frame it as necessary protection against even worse alternatives. They position their questionable behavior as evidence of courage rather than cause for concern. This works because of how human psychology processes relative comparisons. Most people struggle to evaluate whether something meets ideal standards in isolation, but they can easily decide whether it seems better or worse than available alternatives. Control the comparison points, and you control perceptions of your own reasonableness. Frame your opponents as radical extremists, and your own extreme positions appear moderate by contrast. The second part of Machiavelli's strategy involves adaptability. Whosoever desires constant success must change his conduct with the times. The most successful figures don't stick to rigid positions. They adjust which aspects of themselves they emphasize, while keeping the emotional core of their appeal intact. When circumstances require appearing humble, they emphasize service. When situations demand strength, they highlight ambition. When followers crave inspiration, they speak of destiny. When supporters want pragmatism, they discuss strategy. This isn't hypocrisy. It's sophisticated understanding of how human memory and psychology interact. People remember recent impressions more vividly than distant ones, and they interpret new information in ways that confirm their existing beliefs about leaders they've already chosen to support. This leads to perhaps Machiavelli's most practically useful insight. Never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception. But this isn't about outright lies. It's about understanding that the smartest victories happen when your opponents defeat themselves, convinced they're making independent choices. The psychology behind this emerges from cognitive load theory. When people face complex or high-pressure situations, they rely on mental shortcuts rather than careful analysis. Those who understand this can subtly steer outcomes by controlling the context, the available information, and the emotional frame through which others interpret events. Frank Abagnale exemplified this principle. He didn't steal money through force. He gained trust, authority, and access through strategic presentation. Wearing a pilot's uniform granted him free flights and VIP treatment. Speaking confidently about medical procedures he'd barely studied gave him access to hospitals and resources. He never forced compliance. Instead, he created circumstances where people voluntarily granted him privileges and authority based on assumptions they made about his credentials and character. Modern applications appear everywhere once you recognize the pattern. Successful negotiators don't win through superior arguments. They shape the entire context, the setting, the information flow, the sequence of decisions, and the alternatives being considered. By the time formal negotiations begin, the outcome feels predetermined. Technology companies don't force adoption of their platforms. They design user experiences where engagement feels rewarding rather than manipulated. The most powerful influence happens when people believe they're making independent decisions based on their own preferences and analysis. Political campaigns operate similarly. They don't convince voters through policy details that most people lack the time or expertise to evaluate properly. Instead, they create emotional contexts where supporting their candidate feels inevitable, natural, even morally necessary. The key insight? People resist direct persuasion, but embrace conclusions they believe they've reached independently. The art lies in structuring situations so that the choice you want feels like the obvious, rational decision to make. Most counterintuitive insight about success came through a metaphor that sounds dated but reveals timeless truth. Fortune is a woman, and it is necessary, if you wish to master her, to conquer her by force. Stripped of Renaissance phrasing, this reveals something crucial about competitive advantage. Opportunity rewards those who move boldly before certainty exists. Perfect information is a mirage. By the time every fact is gathered and every risk calculated, the moment of advantage has passed. Acting early not only captures fleeting opportunities, but generates real-world feedback that no amount of theoretical analysis can provide. Consider how this dynamic shaped the modern tech landscape. When Google entered the search market, established players like Alta Vista and Yahoo had significant advantages: more resources, better technology, established user bases. But they moved cautiously, conducting extensive market research and focus groups, while Google's founders acted on limited information and refined their approach through rapid iteration. Similar patterns repeat across industries. Academic researchers who publish preliminary findings often advance faster than those who wait for flawless studies. Artists who share imperfect work and refine it through audience feedback outpace perfectionists who hide their creations until they meet impossible standards. Entrepreneurs who launch quickly and adapt beat those who spend years perfecting products in isolation, only to discover that market preferences have shifted, or that their assumptions about customer needs were fundamentally wrong. The point isn't that recklessness always wins. It's that calculated boldness under uncertainty often outperforms endless preparation. The most successful people aren't necessarily the smartest. They're the ones who act when the moment matters, gathering just enough information to make informed bets rather than waiting for certainty that never comes. They understand that hesitation is also a decision, often the costliest one possible. This connects to another principle that explains modern political and business success. Wisdom consists of knowing how to distinguish the nature of trouble and in choosing the lesser evil. Strategic people don't position themselves as perfect solutions. They position themselves as preferable alternatives in situations where all options involve trade-offs. This leverages loss aversion, people's tendency to fear losses more intensely than they value equivalent gains. Someone who can make others focus on avoiding negative outcomes gains support not through inspiration, but through fear of what alternatives might bring. They don't spend energy explaining why their approach will create wonderful outcomes. Instead, they focus on why other approaches will create disasters. They position themselves as necessary choices to prevent catastrophe, not inspiring choices to create paradise. This shifts conversations from absolute standards to relative comparisons, where almost anyone can appear reasonable if the alternatives are framed dramatically enough. Modern examples appear throughout business and politics. Candidates rarely argue they're perfect. They argue they're better than the opposition, focusing voter attention on the opponent's flaws rather than their own limitations. Companies don't claim their products are flawless. They emphasize how much worse competing options would be, highlighting competitor weaknesses rather than defending their own shortcomings. This works because human psychology processes relative comparisons more easily than absolute evaluations. Most people struggle to determine whether something meets ideal standards in isolation, but they can easily decide whether it seems better or worse than available alternatives. The sophisticated version involves strategic comparison management. By controlling what alternatives people consider, you make almost any approach seem reasonable. Frame your questionable behavior as evidence of moderation compared to historical extremists, and suddenly your extreme positions appear centrist. All these tactics lead to a crucial skill for navigating a world where confident fools often hold power. Learning to identify who you're really dealing with. He offered a key insight. The first way to assess a ruler's mind is to look at the people who surround him. The most reliable way to assess anyone's true capabilities isn't listening to their public statements or examining their credentials. It's observing who they choose as advisors and how they respond to disagreement and criticism. Truly intelligent people actively seek advisors who challenge their assumptions, provide expertise they lack, and present uncomfortable information. They create systems that reward honest feedback, even when it contradicts their preferences. They want to be surrounded by people who make them smarter, not people who make them feel smart. In contrast, fundamentally limited people surround themselves with validators who confirm their existing beliefs and avoid presenting complications that might require difficult decisions. They engineer their own ignorance by creating echo chambers that amplify their biases and blind them to emerging threats or opportunities. Winston Churchill exemplified the intelligent approach despite his strong personality and definite opinions. He deliberately sought advisors who would argue with him rather than agree with him. His war cabinet included political rivals and military leaders who frequently challenged his ideas and assumptions. This team of rivals approach helped him make better decisions because he encountered perspectives that tested his thinking rather than confirming his instincts. Even when he ultimately disagreed with advisors, the process of engaging with their arguments strengthened his final decisions. Watch how people handle contradiction and criticism. Do they engage with the strongest versions of opposing arguments, or do they dismiss criticism without serious consideration? Do their advisors come from diverse backgrounds with complementary expertise, or are they chosen primarily for agreement and personal loyalty? These patterns reveal whether you're dealing with genuine intelligence disguised as confidence or actual limitation disguised as certainty. This brings us to one of Machiavelli's most cynical observations about how power actually works in practice. A prince never lacks legitimate reasons to break his promise. He wasn't celebrating dishonesty. He was observing that the masses rarely demand excellence from their leaders. They simply want to avoid feeling actively harmed or completely ignored. Provide enough symbolic attention and material benefits to maintain basic satisfaction, and most people won't notice gradual shifts in priorities or broken commitments. Historical examples reveal how this dynamic operates across cultures and centuries. Populist leaders rise by positioning themselves as champions of ordinary people, providing just enough tangible benefits and recognition to maintain loyalty while pursuing different priorities behind the scenes. Consider how this pattern typically unfolds. A charismatic figure emerges speaking the language of common concerns, promising to fight against established elites and special interests. They hold massive rallies where supporters feel seen and heard by someone powerful. They provide some concrete benefits, higher wages, better conditions, symbolic victories that demonstrate they care about popular concerns. But behind this populist facade, the same leaders often systematically concentrate power, silence opposition voices, and enrich their inner circles. The working classes don't notice or object because they're receiving enough benefits and recognition to feel that someone finally represents their interests. This works because people form emotional attachments to leaders who make them feel valued and heard. Symbolic gestures often matter more than policy details. Once supporters develop emotional investment in a leader, they'll rationalize contradictions rather than admit they were wrong about their champion. These patterns persist across centuries and cultures because they reflect fundamental aspects of human psychology rather than temporary problems that education might solve. As Machiavelli observed, people consistently choose confidence over competence, simplicity over accuracy, and emotional comfort over difficult truth when making quick judgments about authority and influence. This happens because our brains evolves to make fast decisions based on limited information, not to carefully analyze complex modern situations. Our democratic systems, markets, and institutions often reward people who understand psychological dynamics better than those who understand complex technical problems. The most important decisions frequently get made by those who excel at gaining power rather than those who excel at using it wisely. But here's where the analysis becomes more complex. What if the people we dismiss as fools aren't actually lacking sophistication? What if they've discovered something about human nature that genuinely wise people refuse to accept? From ancient forums to modern boardrooms, from medieval courts to social media platforms, the same dynamics play out repeatedly. Those who appear simple often possess a different kind of intelligence, an intuitive understanding of how people actually make decisions versus how we pretend they should make decisions. Consider how many brilliant scientists struggle to communicate urgent findings about climate change, while influencers with minimal scientific training successfully promote environmental causes. The difference isn't knowledge or commitment. It's understanding how human psychology actually works versus how we wish it worked. This creates a world where good intentions without strategic thinking accomplish little beyond personal satisfaction, while sophisticated understanding of human psychology, even when used ethically, can create genuine positive change. This brings us to the most important question: what do we do with this knowledge? Machiavelli wrote The Prince not to celebrate ruthless people, but to understand them well enough that ethical people could compete effectively. He wanted principled individuals to have the tools necessary to succeed in a world where unprincipled people often win by default. 5 centuries later, that challenge remains exactly the same. The world needs people who understand both the complexity of problems and the psychology of solutions. Those who can bridge that gap, translating insight into influence and influence into genuine progress, will determine whether human civilization continues advancing or falls into the hands of those who understand manipulation but lack wisdom. This isn't about becoming manipulative. It's about becoming effective in service of something larger than yourself. It's about recognizing that the most ethical approach often involves learning to communicate truth in ways people can actually receive and act upon, rather than ways that preserve your sense of intellectual purity but accomplish nothing. Consider historical figures who combined strategic thinking with ethical goals. Franklin Roosevelt understood that inspiring confidence was crucial during economic crisis, but he used that confidence to implement programs that genuinely helped people. Churchill built coalitions through psychological sophistication, but in service of defending democracy against genuine threats. They succeeded not by ignoring human psychology, but by understanding it well enough to guide it toward better outcomes. The strategically simple have always had certain advantages in human social systems, but wisdom combined with strategic insight has occasionally managed to guide their energy toward constructive ends. Since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved. But perhaps the real question isn't whether to choose fear or love. Perhaps it's whether we can transcend this ancient dichotomy entirely. The question facing anyone who cares about human progress is whether they're sophisticated enough to learn the language of influence while keeping their values intact. Can you become fluent in the psychology that Machiavelli described without losing your commitment to human flourishing? Can you understand how power really works without becoming corrupted by that understanding? The future may well depend on whether enough people can answer yes to both questions. Because in the end, the world needs leaders who combine Machiavellian insight with genuine virtue. People strategic enough to win and wise enough to use victory for the common good. Understanding these psychological dynamics is the first step toward either using them ethically or protecting yourself from those who don't. The choice of how to apply this knowledge is yours, but the knowledge itself has become essential for anyone who wants to create positive change in an increasingly complex world. The future belongs to fools, unless the wise learn to speak their language.